Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The early autumn sun, still warm but hinting at the coming crispness, spread like liquid gold over the whispering acre. John, his hands calloused and stained with earth, knelt amidst rows of plump, ruby-red heirloom tomatoes. The scent of ripe fruit and rich soil was a balm to his soul, a fragrance he'd known since childhood, a feeling of deep belonging. This land, passed down through generations, was more than just dirt and plants. It was his lineage, his legacy, and his quiet triumph. He'd brought it back from the brink, transforming neglected fields into a vibrant testament to resilience. Each perfectly formed tomato, each sturdy vine, was a silent affirmation of his meticulous care, his unwavering dedication. His life was a symphony of predictable rhythms: the crow of the rooster, the hum of the old Ford tractor, the satisfying thud of ripe produce into baskets. He savored the solitude, finding a profound connection in the silent conversation with the earth. His only regular companion was Aunt Alara, who, with her silver braid and knowing eyes, presided over the converted granary across the yard. She brewed potent herbal teas and dispensed wisdom in equal measure, a gentle anchor in his otherwise solitary world. They shared meals often, discussing the weather, the market, and the subtle shifts in the land. A quiet camaraderie built on decades of unspoken understanding. He had built this life, nurtured it, and it was good. There was a quiet pride in his chest, a deep satisfaction that settled in his bones as he surveyed his verdant domain. He was master of his small, abundant world, a king in a kingdom of heirloom tomatoes. The only discordant note, a faint echo in the otherwise harmonious melody of his life, was the distant memory of Beatrice, his younger sister, who had fled the farm years ago for the concrete canyons of the city, leaving behind a silence that, over time, had become merely another part of the landscape. He rarely thought of her now, so consumed was he by the immediate, tangible realities of the land. It began subtly, a mere annoyance, a persistent tickle in his throat, a need to clear it more often than usual. He dismissed it as a seasonal allergy, perhaps the dust kicked up by the tractor, or the pollen from the late-blooming goldenrod. He was a farmer, after all, accustomed to the minor irritations of rural life. He'd just cough it out, a rough, dry sound that sometimes caught in his chest. But the whisper grew louder. The tickle became a rasp, a persistent hoarseness that clung to his voice like burrs to wool. He found himself clearing his throat constantly, a self-conscious ahem before speaking, a habit that soon became ingrained. A new sensation emerged too, a subtle difficulty swallowing. Not every time, not with liquids, but with larger, drier bites of food, a sense of something catching, a slight effort required to push it down. He attributed it to eating too fast, a farmer's hurried lunch break. He started chewing more deliberately, taking smaller bites. Aunt Alara, however, was not so easily fooled. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, missed nothing. "John," she observed one evening, watching him pick at his stew, "you're not eating like yourself. And your voice, it sounds like winter wind through a broken pane." He waved a dismissive hand. "Just a bit of a bug, Alara. Too much shouting over the combine. You know how it is." "No, I don't," she countered, her voice soft but firm. "I know a man who eats his supper like a starved wolf, and you're picking at it like a finicky sparrow. And that cough, it's been weeks, John. You should see Dr. Aris." He scoffed. "Dr. Aris will tell me to drink more water and get more rest. I've got a harvest to bring in, Alara. No time for coddling." His dismissal was automatic, a reflex honed over years of self-reliance. Weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Besides, it was probably nothing, just a persistent cough. But the growing fatigue, a weariness that seeped into his bones despite a full night's sleep, gnawed at the edges of his dismissiveness. Weeks turned into months. The hoarseness deepened, becoming a constant, gravelly rasp. His attempts at conversation were punctuated by harsh, tearing coughs. The difficulty swallowing escalated. Now even soft food sometimes felt like sandpaper going down, and the effort left him breathless. He was losing weight inexplicably, his sturdy frame beginning to look gaunt beneath his work clothes. His belt, once snug, now cinched several notches tighter. Aunt Alara's gentle prodding turned into outright insistence. "John," she said one morning, her voice laced with an uncharacteristic urgency, "you're fading. I can see it. You can pretend all you like, but you're a shadow of the man you were. You're going to Dr. Aris today, or I'll call him myself and tell him you're too stubborn to save." Her eyes, usually full of quiet warmth, were now etched with worry. He grumbled, but something in her voice, a fear he recognized as genuine, broke through his stubborn resolve. The image of the bountiful harvest, once a source of deep joy, now felt like a crushing burden. He was too tired to argue. The doctor's office, bright and sterile, felt alien after the earthy embrace of his farm. Dr. Aris, a woman who radiated competence and an almost intimidating directness, listened patiently as John, in a voice barely above a whisper, recounted his symptoms. Her gaze was steady, assessing, missing nothing. She pressed on his throat, listened to his lungs, and then, with a professional calm that did little to mask the underlying concern in her eyes, she delivered the words that shattered his quiet world. "John, your larynx looks inflamed, and there's a mass that concerns me greatly. I'm referring you immediately to an oncologist, a specialist. We need a biopsy, and we need it yesterday." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet the urgency crackled in the air between them. The biopsy confirmed her fears. The phone call came on a Tuesday, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple. John sat on the porch swing, the receiver heavy in his hand. "Mr. Miller," the specialist's voice, calm and measured, informed him, "the results are back. It's stage 3 laryngeal squamous cell carcinoma. A shadow in your throat, John. We need to start treatment immediately." The words hung in the air, a death knell in the twilight silence. Stage the 3rd, cancer, his throat, the very organ that allowed him to speak, to sing, to feel the crisp autumn air, to call to his dogs, to bargain at the market. It was an invasion, a betrayal from within. Disbelief washed over him, thick and suffocating. It couldn't be, not him. He was a man of the earth, strong, resilient. How could something so insidious take root in him? Then came the anger, hot and bitter. Anger at the world, at the unfairness, at his own body for failing him. And beneath it all, a cold, creeping fear, a vulnerability he'd never known. The king of his tomato kingdom was suddenly a fragile mortal man, facing an enemy he couldn't plow under or prune away. Aunt Alara, who had been hovering anxiously in the doorway, saw the color drain from his face, the way his shoulders slumped, the sudden, profound defeat in his eyes. She knew. She simply knew. She crossed the porch in an instant, her hand finding his. Her face, usually so serene, was etched with pain, but her grip was firm, resolute. She said nothing, but her presence was a lifeline, a silent promise that he would not face this shadow alone. The earth, which had always embraced him, now seemed to hold him in a different, more terrifying embrace, one that threatened to pull him into its depths. The harvest, so close, now felt impossibly distant, overshadowed by the stark reality of the battle that lay ahead. His only regular companion was Aunt Alara, perched in the converted granary across the yard, her presence a comforting, if sometimes meddlesome, constant. He'd even, begrudgingly, admitted to a quiet satisfaction when the local agricultural fair awarded his Brandywine tomatoes the coveted blue ribbon for the 3rd year running. Life on the Whispering Acre was good, predictable, and John had always believed entirely within his control. Then came the whisper, not the gentle rustle of corn stalks or the soft murmur of the wind through the ancient oaks that gave the farm its name, but a persistent, irritating rasp in his own throat. At first he dismissed it. Late summer allergies, maybe. Too much yelling at the tractor when it inevitably sputtered. He was a farmer, after all. A little phlegm and a hoarse voice were occupational hazards, easily remedied with a swig of water and a dismissive cough. But the whisper persisted, growing steadily into a grating croak. He found himself clearing his throat constantly, a dry, almost painful scraping sound. It became a habit, an unconscious tick that punctuated every sentence. Auntie Lara, with her hawk-like gaze and uncanny ability to notice every stray leaf on the property, was the first to comment. "John, you sound like a frog in a well," she'd observed one crisp morning, setting a mug of her infamous dandelion tea before him. "And you're picking at your eggs again. Don't tell me the hens are on strike," he'd grunted, pushing the half-eaten breakfast away. "Just a bit of a tickle. Nothing a day's work won't cure." But even as he said it, the act of swallowing the dry toast felt like pushing sandpaper down his gullet. He'd started choosing softer foods, leaning heavily on Alara's thick vegetable stews, claiming he was saving his teeth. The subtle difficulty swallowing evolved into a noticeable effort, a conscious adjustment of how he chewed, how he tilted his head to get the food down. The satisfaction of a hearty meal, once a cornerstone of his day, began to wane, replaced by a dull dread before each plate. He tried to ignore it, to outwork it. He spent longer hours in the fields, pushing his body as if sheer physical exertion could somehow purge the unwelcome intruder from his throat. But the fatigue was a new, unwelcome companion, a heavy cloak that settled over him even after a full night's sleep. The crisp autumn air, once invigorating, seemed to catch in his throat, making the rasp worse. He noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he picked tomatoes, a faint dizziness if he stood too quickly. He blamed the early mornings, the late nights, the relentless demands of the harvest. Anna Lara, however, was not so easily dissuaded. She started leaving bottles of various herbal concoctions on his porch. Elderberry syrup, slippery elm bark tea, even a pungent brew of ginger and honey. He dutifully choked them down, more to appease her than from any real belief in their efficacy. "John," she'd said, her voice unusually firm one evening, as he coughed himself into a fit. "You're fading. You've lost weight. You're not yourself. This isn't just a tickle. You need to see Dr. Aris." He'd bristled. "Don't be ridiculous, Alara. There's nothing wrong with me a good night's sleep and a less dramatic aunt wouldn't fix." His voice, even to his own ears, was a strained, reedy whisper, a far cry from the booming call that once commanded his fields. But the symptoms continued their insidious march. The weight loss became undeniable, his work jeans feeling looser, his belt requiring an extra notch. His throat clearing was almost constant now, a desperate, rattling effort. And then came the breathing. A slight wheeze at first, then a high-pitched, almost musical sound that accompanied each inhale. Stridor, though John didn't know the word. It was a suffocating sensation, as if a fist were slowly tightening around his windpipe. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his stoicism. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, gasping for air, the silence of the farm replaced by the terrifying sound of his own struggling lungs. The morning he collapsed in the tomato patch, the stridor a terrifying shriek with every breath, was the morning Anna Lara stopped asking. She simply called Dr. Aris. John, gasping, humiliated, and terrified, could only nod weakly. Dr. Aris, a woman whose no-nonsense demeanor masked a deep well of compassion, took one look at John's pale face, listened to his labored breathing, and felt his throat. Her expression, usually unreadable, tightened with concern. She didn't mince words. "John, this is serious. I'm sending you for an urgent scope and imaging. Today, I'm calling the specialist now." The next few days blurred into a terrifying kaleidoscope of sterile rooms, cold instruments, and hushed voices. The scope, a thin tube snaking down his throat, felt like a violation. The MRI scanner, a claustrophobic tunnel of thumping and whirring, magnified his fear. He lay there, a farmer accustomed to the vastness of the sky, now trapped in a narrow tube, helpless. And then came the diagnosis. Dr. Aris sat opposite him in her office, her face grave. Aunt Alara held his hand, her knuckles white. "John," the doctor began, her voice gentle but firm, "the imaging shows a significant mass, and the biopsy results confirmed it. It's stage 3 laryngeal squamous cell carcinoma, cancer of the voice box." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, far more real than the shadow in his throat. Cancer, stage 3, voice box. The quiet strength he had always relied on, The resilience he drew from the earth crumbled into dust. He stared at her, disbelieving. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not to John, the man who built his life on hard work and healthy living. The man who had revived the Whispering Acre. Auntie Lara squeezed his hand, her own eyes brimming with tears, but her gaze was resolute. "We'll fight this, John," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll fight it together." But all John could feel was a profound, bone-deep shock. The whisper had become a roar, and the shadow in his throat was now a terrifying, undeniable reality. His predictable, controlled world had been violently upended, replaced by a crushing fear and an agonizing sense of vulnerability. The land, his solace, now seemed a million miles away. He was on unfamiliar ground, a battlefield he never imagined he'd have to tread. He found himself clearing his throat constantly, a dry, rasping sound that grated on his own ears. Then came the difficulty swallowing. Not every meal, not at first, but certain textures. A particularly fibrous piece of sourdough bread, a chunk of roasted potato, seemed to catch, requiring an extra gulp of water, a subtle grimace. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to eating too fast, or maybe just getting older. Aunt Lara, however, with her unsettling knack for noticing everything, began to raise an eyebrow. "You're picking at your food, John," she'd observed one crisp September evening, watching him push around a plate of her famously hearty beef stew. "And your voice sounds like a rusty gate hinge," he'd grunted, deflecting. "Just tired, Alara. Long days." But the long days turned into weeks, and the whisper became a rasp, then a noticeable croak. The difficulty swallowing solidified into a conscious effort, each mouthful a calculated risk. The weight loss, initially a welcome side effect of his vigorous farm work, grew alarming. His jeans, once snug, now hung loose around his hips. The true turning point came one morning when he woke up to a new, unsettling sound accompanying his every breath, a high-pitched wheeze, a subtle whistling in his throat that felt less like air moving freely and more like it was being forced through a narrowing pipe. Stridor, though he didn't know the medical term then, was the sound of a body struggling for air, and it terrified him. Aunt Alara, her face etched with a worry she rarely showed, didn't ask this time. She simply stood by his bed, holding out his clean work shirt, then pointed to the truck keys on his dresser. "Dr. Aris, now." Her voice was quiet, but held an iron will that John, weakened by the relentless cough and growing fatigue, found himself unable to resist. The local clinic, usually a place of minor ailments and routine checkups, felt different. Dr. Aris, a woman whose stern demeanor was softened by kind eyes, listened patiently, her gaze never leaving his face. She felt his throat, palpated his neck, shone a light into his mouth. Her expression remained neutral, but John felt a cold dread begin to coil in his stomach. "John," she began, her voice calm, professional, "your vocal cords are quite inflamed, and there's a mass, a growth, that I can feel. I'm going to refer you directly to an ENT specialist. It needs to be looked at quickly." She used the word mass. In John's mind, usually so clear and logical, felt like it was slogging through mud. He nodded, numb. The next few days were a blur of appointments, bright lights, and invasive procedures. A scope down his throat, a biopsy. He tried to maintain his farmer's stoicism, but the unfamiliarity of it all, the clinical detachment of the specialists, chipped away at his composure. Aunt Lara was a constant silent presence, her hand often resting on his arm, a comforting anchor in a sea of medical jargon. Then came the diagnosis. Dr. Aris, her face grave, sat him down in her office, Ilara beside him. "John," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "the biopsy results are back. It's laryngeal squamous cell carcinoma, stage 3. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cancer, in his throat, the very organ that allowed him to speak, to call to his dogs, to bargain at the market, to sing quietly to himself as he worked the land. The shadow wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a hungry beast occupying his very voice. Disbelief was his first reaction, a gut punch that stole his breath. "No," he rasped, his voice a pathetic caricature of his former self. "That can't be right. I'm a farmer. I'm strong." Dr. Eris's expression softened. "John, I understand this is a shock. It's aggressive, but it's treatable. We need to act quickly." She began to talk about chemotherapy, radiation, treatment plans, but the words were distant, muffled. All he could hear was cancer and stage 3, stage 3. He knew enough about farming, about life cycles, to know that stage 3 was far from the beginning. It was serious. It was a threat to everything he was, everything he had built. Aunt Alara squeezed his hand, her own trembling slightly. He looked at her, at the raw pain in her eyes, and the disbelief gave way to a wave of anger. Anger at his body for betraying him, anger at the unfairness of it all, anger at himself for ignoring the early signs. Then beneath the anger, a cold, sharp blade of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the pain, fear of losing his voice, his farm, his very life. The invincible farmer, rooted in his land, suddenly felt terrifyingly vulnerable, a prize-winning tomato plant struck by an unseen blight. The earth's embrace, which had always felt so comforting, now seemed to be loosening its grip. The harvest, just weeks away, suddenly felt impossibly far. The stark white walls of the oncology ward were a brutal contrast to the rich, earthy tones of the Whispering Acre. John, usually so grounded in the tangible world of soil and sun, felt adrift, his body a battlefield where foreign chemicals waged war. The doctors, precise and clinical, had outlined the plan: concurrent chemotherapy and radiation, a merciless assault designed to eradicate the squamous cells that had taken root in his throat. He'd nodded, numb, as they spoke of cycles and fractions, words that sounded like abstract mathematical equations, utterly divorced from the visceral reality of his deteriorating body. The initial days of treatment were a blur of nausea and profound fatigue. The chemotherapy, delivered intravenously, felt like ice flowing through his veins, leaving a metallic taste in his mouth that no amount of water could wash away. His appetite, already diminished, vanished entirely. Each bite of food became an act of sheer will, a torturous journey down a throat that felt increasingly raw and constricted. The radiation, delivered by a humming machine that felt both futuristic and menacing, left his skin red and tender, a constant, burning reminder of the unseen enemy within. But it was the voice that truly broke him. The persistent hoarseness, once merely an annoyance, deepened into a strained croak, then a mere whisper, and finally a painful, soundless expulsion of air. He, John Miller, a man whose commands to his farm hands had once carried across acres, whose gentle murmur had soothed a restless calf, was silenced. It wasn't just the inability to speak, it was the loss of a fundamental part of his identity. How could he be a farmer without his voice, without the ability to call his dog, to haggle with suppliers, to even utter a simple "good morning" to Aunt Alara? The quiet despair gnawed at him, a constant companion in the sterile hospital room. Aunt Alara, a steadfast sentinel, was there every day, her presence a balm and a burden. She brought him broth she'd made from vegetables grown on his own land, though he could barely swallow it. She read aloud from his well-worn farming journals, her voice a comforting drone that often lulled him into a fitful sleep. Her eyes, however, held a grief that mirrored his own, and sometimes he found her unwavering hope almost unbearable. He didn't want hope, he wanted his old life back. He wanted to feel the soil between his fingers, to taste a ripe tomato directly from the vine, to shout at a stubborn tractor without pain. Then she arrived, Beatrice, his younger sister who had fled the farm for the city years ago, driven by a silent, unspoken rift that neither of them had ever fully acknowledged. She walked into his hospital room like a ghost, her city clothes and sharp, anxious eyes a jarring contrast to the quiet, rural rhythms that defined his existence. "John," she said, her voice thin, uncertain. Aunt Alara called. He just looked at her, his throat too tight to even attempt a sound. A wave of resentment, cold and familiar, washed over him. Why now? Why, when he was at his most vulnerable, his least capable? Where had she been for the past decade? when he was painstakingly rebuilding the farm, trying to mend the neglect of their father's later years. Beatrice, sensing his unspoken animosity, fidgeted. She wasn't one for emotional grandstanding. Instead, she moved with an awkward efficiency. She straightened the hospital sheets, adjusted his pillow, even organized the clutter of medical supplies on his bedside table. "I brought you some books," she mumbled, placing a stack of glossy magazines, urban gardening, architecture, beside his bed. He glanced at them, a small, bitter laugh catching in his throat, as if he had the energy or the inclination to read about rooftop gardens. "I can stay for a few days," she offered, her voice gaining a touch more confidence as she found practical tasks to occupy her hands. "Can help Ilara with things on the farm." She sounded overwhelmed. He closed his eyes, a silent refusal. He didn't want her help. He didn't want her pity. He just wanted to be left alone with his pain, his frustration, and the gnawing fear that he would never truly recover. Her presence, a reminder of their fractured past, felt like another burden, an unwelcome complication in a life already consumed by illness. He knew intellectually that her being there was a gesture of concern, however clumsy, but emotionally he recoiled, retreating further into the shell of his suffering. The unfamiliar battlefield of his body was enough. He had no energy left for the unfamiliar battlefield of family. He longed for the simple, predictable challenges of the soil, not the thorny, unpredictable terrain of human connection. The crushing silence descended like a shroud, heavier than any autumn fog. John had thought the initial shock of diagnosis and the first brutal weeks of treatment were the worst, but he was wrong. The initial side effects of the concurrent chemo and radiation had been a prelude. This was the full, devastating symphony. His throat, once merely irritated, was now a raw, inflamed wasteland. The radiation burns were relentless, a searing agony that made every swallow, every breath, a fresh torment. The doctors had warned him about mucositis, about the painful sores that would line his mouth and throat, but the clinical explanation had done little to prepare him for the reality. It felt like he was swallowing broken glass, each attempt bringing tears to his eyes. Eating, once a simple joy, became an impossible task. The meager portions of soft, bland food Aunt Ilara painstakingly pureed for him would sit untouched, the very thought of them causing a wave of nausea. "You have to try, dear," Aunt Ilara would plead, her voice thick with worry, her hand gently stroking his feverish brow. "Just a spoonful." He couldn't. The effort was too great, the pain too immense. Dr. Aris, seeing his rapid decline, had ordered the insertion of a percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, PEG tube, a feeding tube. The procedure itself had been a minor indignity compared to everything else, but the constant presence of the tube, a physical manifestation of his utter inability to sustain himself, was a constant reminder of his helplessness. He was a farmer, a man who worked the earth, who produced sustenance. Now he was sustained by liquid nutrition pumped directly into his stomach, bypassing the very organ that was failing him. His voice, already a ragged croak, withered away entirely. It was a profound loss, more than he could have imagined. His connection to the land, to the rhythms of his days, had always been punctuated by his resonant voice, calling to the dogs, humming as he worked, grumbling affectionately at the stubborn soil. Now only painful gasps escaped his lips. When he tried to speak, his vocal cords, inflamed and swollen, produced nothing but a faint, whistling wheeze, a sound that quickly devolved into a choked cough, leaving him breathless and panicking. The panic attacks were new and terrifying. They would strike without warning, usually in the quiet hours of the night. His throat felt like it was closing, the shadow that was consuming him now a physical presence, tightening its grip, stealing his air. He'd thrash in the bed, gasping, clawing at his neck, the primal fear of suffocation overwhelming him. Aunt Ilara would rush in, her face pale in the dim light, guiding him through breathing exercises she'd learned from a hospice nurse years ago. Her calm presence, a fragile tether to reality. She'd hold his hand, murmuring reassurances, but even her unwavering strength seemed to be wearing thin. Despair, cold and insidious, began to seep into every corner of his being. He questioned everything. What was the purpose of this relentless suffering? He had always found solace in the land, in the simple, honest cycle of growth and decay, life and death. But now even the earth seemed to mock him, thriving outside while he withered within. He had always believed in a quiet, inherent justice in the world, in the universe. But this was just brutal, senseless punishment. He felt spiritually desolate, a dried-up riverbed where a vibrant current once flowed. He pushed Anilara away, not with words, he had none, but with silence, with averted eyes, with a palpable wall of misery. He could see the pain in her eyes, the worry etched deeper into her already lined face, and it only made him more bitter. He didn't want her pity, didn't want her relentless optimism. He wanted to be left alone with his suffering, to sink into the darkness that beckoned. He was a burden, a grotesque shadow of his former self, and he knew it. Beatrice, surprisingly, continued her hesitant, emotionally distant visits. She'd bring him small, practical things. A new, softer pillow for his aching head, a lavender-scented eye mask to block out the harsh hospital lights, even a collection of classic audiobooks, knowing he couldn't read. She'd sit quietly by his bedside, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, simply existing in the same space. He rarely acknowledged her, his resentment a cold knot in his stomach. Her quiet presence, however, was a constant, almost irritating reminder of the life he was losing, the family he was failing. He saw her through a haze of pain and self-pity, her awkward attempts at connection reinforcing his conviction that he was utterly, irrevocably alone in this crushing silence. He was dissolving, piece by painful piece, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The crushing silence descended like a shroud, heavier than any autumn fog. John had thought the initial shock of diagnosis and the first brutal weeks of treatment were the worst, but he was wrong. The initial side effects of the concurrent chemo and radiation had been a prelude. This was the full, devastating symphony. His throat, once merely irritated, was now a raw, inflamed wasteland. The radiation burns were relentless, a searing agony that made every swallow, every breath, a fresh torment. The doctors had warned him about mucositis, about the painful sores that would line his mouth and throat. But the clinical explanation had done little to prepare him for the reality. It felt like he was swallowing broken glass, each attempt bringing tears to his eyes. Eating, once a simple joy, became an impossible task. The meager portions of soft, bland food Anilara painstakingly pureed for him would sit untouched, the very thought of them causing a wave of nausea. "You have to try, dear," Anilara would plead, her voice laden with worry, holding a spoonful of cream of wheat. "Just a little." John would turn his head away, the effort of even that small movement feeling monumental. The weight loss, once a concern, was now alarming. His clothes hung on him, transforming his once sturdy farmer's frame into something gaunt and fragile. His jawline, previously strong and defined, was now hollowed, shadowed by the relentless assault. The loss of his voice was perhaps the cruelest blow. The hoarseness had progressed to a painful rasp, and then, after another particularly brutal radiation session, it had all but vanished. Words became a torturous effort, emerging as strained, choked whispers that barely carried across the room. He communicated mostly through gestures, or by writing on a small notepad Anilara kept by his bedside. The silence, once a comfort on his solitary farm, now felt like a prison. He was trapped inside himself, his thoughts screaming, his vocal cords paralyzed. The worst, though, was the stridor, a high-pitched, wheezing sound that accompanied each breath, a constant, terrifying reminder of the tumor's relentless encroachment on his airway. It started subtly, a faint whistling, but soon it grew louder, more insistent, especially when he lay down. Sleep became a battle, each gasp for air punctuated by the chilling sound. Panic attacks, once an alien concept, became a nightly terror. He would wake up drenched in sweat, clawing at his throat, convinced he was suffocating, the stridor a siren of impending doom. Anilara, sleepless and drawn, would rush to his side, her gentle hands running over his forehead, whispering reassurances. "Breathe, John. Just breathe with me. You're all right. You're safe." but her eyes, usually so bright with an almost mischievous spark, now held a deep, unshakable sorrow. He knew she blamed herself, in some unspoken way, for not forcing him to the doctor sooner, for not seeing the signs more clearly. And in his despair, he resented her worry, her tireless efforts, because they highlighted his own helplessness, his humiliating dependence. He pushed her away verbally when he could manage a croak, physically when he had the strength. "Leave me alone, Alara," he rasped one night, swatting her hand away when she tried to adjust his pillow. "Just leave me." Her face crumbled, but she didn't leave. She retreated to the worn armchair in the corner of his bedroom, her silent vigil a constant, unwelcome presence. He felt like a trapped animal, gnawing at his own leg to escape the snare. What was the point? He was a farmer, connected to the land, beholden to the rhythms of life and growth. Now he was a husk, a breathing corpse, stripped of his purpose, his dignity. The spiritual solace he'd once found tending to his heirloom tomatoes, feeling the earth in his hands, seemed like a cruel joke. Where was the fairness in this? What had he done to deserve such a slow, agonizing dissolution? He had always worked hard, lived honestly, revered the land. Was this his reward? One particularly brutal night, the stridor was so pronounced, so terrifying, that Alara finally broke. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her voice, usually so steady, trembled with a raw emotion he hadn't heard from her in decades. "John," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through his fog of pain and self-pity. "There's something you need to hear, something I should have told you years ago." She moved from the armchair to the edge of his bed, her gaze piercing, unwavering, despite the dim light from the bedside lamp. He tried to wave her away, to retreat further into his shell of despair, but her grip on his arm was surprisingly firm. He couldn't speak, could only meet her desperate gaze. "It's about Beatrice," she said, and at the mention of his estranged sister, a fresh wave of resentment washed over him. Beatrice, who had visited sporadically, her offers of help feeling more like obligations than genuine care. Her presence was a stark reminder of the rift that separated them, a wound he had always kept carefully bandaged, never truly acknowledging its depth. "And it's about the farm," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength, as if speaking a long-held truth was finally liberating her. "And about our grandfather, your mother's father, Elias." John grunted, a sound of dismissive irritation. He knew the story, or thought he did. Beatrice had left because she couldn't stand the farm life, because she was too delicate for the hard physical labor, too drawn to the city's superficial allure, a betrayal of their heritage in his eyes. Alara ignored his dismissiveness. "Your grandfather Elias," she said, her voice dropping, "was a proud man. Too proud sometimes. When the county survey came through in the late 70s, it shifted the official boundary line with the Miller property just a few feet onto our side. A tiny sliver of land, John, barely a ditch. But Elias, he swore that survey was wrong. He insisted Old Man Miller had moved the markers, cheated him, and he spread that story." John frowned, a flicker of confusion cutting through his pain. What did this have to do with anything? "But it wasn't true," Alara said, her voice heavy with regret. "The survey was correct. It was a mistake of the old hand-drawn maps. And Elias knew it, deep down. But he wouldn't back down. He valued his pride more than the truth. And it festered." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Beatrice's mother, your Aunt Eleanor, she was married to one of the Miller boys, Arthur. Elias. He never forgave her for that. Said she'd chosen the enemy over her own blood. And when this boundary dispute blew up, he forbade Eleanor from setting foot on this land, on the Whispering Acre, ever again. Said she was a traitor, a liar, just like her husband." John stared at her, the pain in his throat momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, unsettling dread. Aunt Eleanor. He barely remembered her. She'd been a ghost, a name whispered in hushed tones, excised from family gatherings, her memory shrouded in a thick veil of unspoken shame. He'd always assumed she'd done something truly terrible, something unforgivable, to be so completely cut off. "Eleanor tried to explain," Alara continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point, reliving the memory. She tried to reconcile, but Elias wouldn't hear it. He hardened his heart. And your mother, bless her soul, she went along with him. The shame of it all, the way we treated Eleanor, it split the family. Beatrice, she saw it, John. She was a little girl, but she saw the injustice. She saw how much it hurt her mother, how much it hurt Eleanor. Elara's gaze returned to him, full of a deep, ancient sorrow. Beatrice loved Aunt Eleanor, and she saw how easily our family, our land, could turn on its own, based on a lie, a stubborn refusal to admit fault. She hated the way the land had become a symbol of that bitterness, not a place of refuge. She grew up with that unspoken tension, that generational wound. And when she left John, she wasn't just leaving the farm, she was running from the shadow Elias cast, the shadow of unforgiveness, the shadow of a lie that poisoned our roots. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the crushing silence of his illness, but a heavy, pregnant stillness, filled with the weight of generations of unspoken pain. John lay there, the stridor still whistling in his throat, but now a different kind of constriction tightened his chest. A new pain, an emotional one, sharp and unexpected, pierced through the physical agony. He had always seen himself as the guardian of the farm, the one who had revived its soil. But what about its soul? What about the hidden, unseen roots that had been festering for decades, poisoned by a lie he hadn't even known existed? Elara's words echoed in the room. Just as the land needs healing from old wounds, so too does their family. The notion that his physical decay might be intertwined with this ancient, unacknowledged wound was preposterous. Yet, a seed had been planted, a seed of doubt, of curiosity, and of a strange, dawning realization that perhaps his battle wasn't just physical. Perhaps there was another kind of tilling, another kind of healing that needed to take place before the land, or he could truly be whole. And that thought, though initially met with a surge of anger at the revelation of such a long-held secret, began to flicker with a fragile, almost imperceptible light in the darkness of his despair. You have to try, dear. Elara's voice, a soft, insistent hum, was a constant backdrop to his misery. Just a spoonful, for strength. But strength was a forgotten word. His body was a battlefield, ravaged by the very things meant to save him. The weight loss, once concerning, was now alarming. His cheekbones protruded sharply, his eyes hollowed pits in a gaunt face. The feeding tube snaked through his nose and taped to his cheek was a humiliating testament to his utter physical failure. A constant reminder that his body, once vibrant and robust, had betrayed him. And his voice, the persistent whisper, had faded to a painful croak, then to nothing more than a strained whisper, and finally to silence. Complete, utter silence. It wasn't just the physical inability to form sounds. It was the psychological assault of being voiceless. A farmer whose life was lived in communion with the land, calling to his dog, shouting over the roar of the tractor, greeting neighbors with a hearty "morning." Now he communicated in frustrated gestures and pained expressions. The silence was crushing, a tombstone on his spirit. The constant pain, the inability to eat, the loss of his voice, it all coalesced into a suffocating despair. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, his quiet strength. Now he was utterly dependent, a burden. Panic, cold and sharp, would seize him, particularly at night. He'd lie awake, listening to the agonizingly loud rasp of his own breathing, feeling his airway constrict, imagining the shadow in his throat growing, tightening its grip until he could no longer draw breath. These were the moments he questioned everything. His life's purpose, the fairness of his fate, the very spiritual solace he once found in the land. Where was the connection now? Where was the comfort in the earth when his body was failing him so spectacularly? He pushed Elara away, not with words, for he had none, but with his silence, his averted gaze, his rigid withdrawal. Her gentle ministrations became an unbearable reminder of his helplessness. He saw the heartbreak in her eyes, the worry etched deeper into her already lined face, and it only intensified his self-loathing. He was a black hole, sucking the light from everything around him. He wanted to be left alone, to wallow in the dark, suffocating comfort of his despair. Then came the night Ilara broke, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating sorrow. He lay staring at the ceiling, lost in the familiar labyrinth of pain and panic, when her voice, uncharacteristically firm, cut through the oppressive silence of the room. "John," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you're drowning, and I won't let you." He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a raw, unyielding determination in them he hadn't seen since his mother's passing. "There's a story," she began, her gaze fixed on something beyond him, lost in memory. "A story I should have told you years ago. A truth that's festered in this land, in this family, like a blight." He wanted to dismiss her, to retreat into his shell, but something in her tone, the sheer weight of unspoken history, held him captive. "Your grandfather, Josiah," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He was a proud man, too proud. There was a boundary line between our farm and the Miller place, just down the creek, a small strip of land, barely an acre. They'd always shared it for generations, a handshake agreement. But then a new survey came through, a bureaucratic fuss for a new road, and it showed the line shifted just a few feet, putting that acre squarely on our side. Old man Miller, he wasn't a bad sort, just a bit stubborn. He claimed it was a mistake, that the old ways were the true ways. Josiah, he saw it as a challenge, a chance to solidify his claim, to prove he was right." Ilara paused, her eyes glazing over. "He swore on his mother's grave that the land had always been ours. He knew it wasn't entirely true, not in spirit at least. He'd been told by his own father that it was a shared space, a gesture of good neighborliness. But Josiah let pride and a touch of greed cloud his judgment. He drew a new fence, right on the surveyed line, taking what he knew, deep down, wasn't rightfully his, not in the way that mattered." John shifted, a flicker of irritation sparking in him. What did this old story have to do with his choking throat? "The Millers, they were hurt," Ilara went on, ignoring his unspoken protest. "Not just by the land, but by the betrayal. And your Aunt Eleanor, Beatrice's mother, she was sweet on young Thomas Miller at the time. She saw the injustice, the meanness of it. She tried to speak up, to reason with Josiah, but he wouldn't hear it. He called her disloyal, a traitor to her own family. He forbade her from seeing Thomas, from even speaking to the Millers. And when she defied him, when she continued to see Thomas in secret, he cut her off, completely, shamed her from the family farm, said she was no longer a whispering acre woman." The words hung in the air, heavy with decades of unspoken bitterness. John felt a strange chill, a dawning realization that tied a knot in his gut. "Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice regaining its strength, "she never knew the full story, just that her mother was disowned for some vague slight. She carried that wound, John. She saw how you, how I, how all of us perpetuated the silence, the unspoken judgment. She saw the land, the farm, as the very thing that had torn her family apart, that had stolen her mother's peace. That's why she left. Not just for the city lights, but to escape the toxic legacy of a lie." Ilara leaned forward, her voice dropping again, but with an intensity that pierced through his despair. "Just as this land, John, needs healing from old wounds, from years of neglect, from the blight of a lie, so too does our family. This illness, perhaps it's a symptom, not just of a physical decay, but of a deeper spiritual one. A mirror reflecting the unspoken, the unforgiven, the unacknowledged pain that binds us. You've always been so rooted in the earth, John. You know how old wounds, left untended, can poison the soil. Perhaps it's time to till the inner soil." Her words, though initially met with a surge of anger. How dare she suggest his illness was some kind of spiritual failing? Slowly, insidiously, began to work their way into his consciousness. The sheer audacity of her claim, the raw honesty, chipped away at his self-pity. A different kind of pain, an emotional one he hadn't acknowledged, began to throb beneath the physical agony. The idea that his body was mirroring a deeper, familial wound was a terrifying, yet strangely compelling thought. It planted a seed, not of medical hope, but of a different kind of possibility, a different kind of healing. Morning. His voice, his very identity, had been stolen. Now only painful gasps escaped his throat, ragged, desperate attempts to draw air into lungs that felt increasingly constricted. The stridor, that high-pitched, rasping sound, had begun subtly, a faint whistle on inspiration, easily masked by the ever-present hum of the oxygen concentrator. But in the last few days it had grown relentless, a terrifying accompaniment to his every breath. It was the sound of a closing airway, a physical manifestation of the shadow that had taken root within him, now reaching out to choke the very life from his body. Panic, a cold, sharp claw, gripped him. He'd woken in the dead of night, clawing at his throat, the air suddenly thin, distant. The stridor was a scream, a desperate, unheard plea. He tried to call out, to Aunt Alara, to anyone, but only a gurgling, choking sound emerged. He was drowning on dry land. Aunt Alara, ever vigilant, had heard the desperate struggle. Her face, usually a picture of calm resilience, was etched with fear as she flicked on the bedside lamp. Her eyes, wide and knowing, met his. She didn't need words. The terror in his gaze, the frantic, useless grasping at his own throat, spoke volumes. "Oh, John, my dear boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. She pressed the emergency call button, her hand already reaching for his, her touch a desperate anchor in a swirling sea of fear. The next hours were a blur of blinding lights, hurried voices, and the crushing weight of medical urgency. The paramedics, their faces grim, had worked with swift, practiced efficiency. The ambulance ride was a symphony of flashing blue lights and the urgent wail of the siren, each jarring turn and jolt sending fresh spasms of pain through his throat. He felt himself slipping, the world blurring at the edges, the stridor a constant, terrifying companion. He was in the emergency room, a cacophony of beeping machines and urgent whispers. Dr. Aris, her face pale beneath the harsh, fluorescent lights, stood over him, her expression grim. "John, your airway, it's severely compromised. We need to intubate, now. It's the only way to secure your breathing." Intubation. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. It meant a tube down his throat, a machine breathing for him. It meant complete surrender, complete loss of control. It meant the cancer, the shadow, had won. He shook his head, a desperate, futile gesture, but he couldn't form the words. The stridor was a deafening roar in his own ears, leaving no room for argument, no space for defiance. A specialist, a young, earnest respiratory therapist, leaned in, her voice calm amidst the gathering storm. "John, we understand this is frightening, but it's critical. Your oxygen levels are dropping. We're losing you." His vision swam. He was on the very precipice, the darkness beckoning. This was it, the grand, brutal finale. All that internal work, the tentative tilling of his inner soil, the flicker of hope for reconciliation, it had all been for naught. The physical reality, the relentless march of the disease was simply too powerful. But then a raw, primal surge of defiance ripped through him. Not against the doctors, not against the inevitable, but against the silent, suffocating regret. He couldn't go like this, not with the words unspoken, the apology unsaid. He had to try, one last desperate act of emotional courage. He looked at Aunt Alara, her face streaked with tears, clutching his hand. He focused every ounce of his remaining will, every scrap of breath, on forming the words. It was a searing pain, a tearing sensation in his throat, but he pushed. A rasping, ragged sound, barely audible, escaped his lips. "Tell Bea," he choked, the effort leaving him gasping, his chest heaving. The stridor intensified, a desperate wheeze. Alara leaned closer, her ear almost to his lips. "What, dear? What about Beatrice?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He tried again, forcing the air out, burning his throat. "I'm sorry." The words were raw, torn from the deepest part of him. His eyes, swimming with tears, pleaded with her to understand, to somehow convey the immense weight of that apology. About the boundary, the farm. He collapsed back against the gurney, utterly spent, the stritter a high-pitched shriek as the medical team moved in, preparing the intubation equipment. He saw Lara nod, a look of profound understanding and sorrow on her face, before the world went dark. Aunt Lara, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, stood by as the doctors swiftly intubated John, the mechanical hiss of the ventilator replacing the terrifying stridor. She watched his chest rise and fall rhythmically, artificially. He was alive for now, but the look on the doctor's face, the hushed conversations, the constant monitoring of machines, spoke of a battle they were losing. She stepped out into the sterile white corridor, pulling out her ancient flip phone, her fingers trembling. Her eyes, still blurred with tears, found Beatrice's number. It was late, past midnight, but she didn't hesitate. "Beatrice," she said, her voice cracking, "it's John. He's critical. They've had to intubate him. The doctors, they're not optimistic." She paused, choking back a sob. "He said something, B, just before. He said to tell you he was sorry. About the boundary, about the farm. He meant it, dear. He truly did." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a long, heavy pause that stretched into an eternity. Lara could almost hear the years of hurt, the entrenched resentment, the carefully constructed emotional walls, being confronted by the stark reality of impending loss. Then Beatrice's voice, tight with suppressed emotion, cut through the silence. "I'm coming. I'm on my way." Lara hung up, a fragile flicker of hope, barely a spark in the overwhelming darkness, kindling in her heart. John had spoken. He had reached out, and Beatrice was coming. It was all a mother hen like her could do now, to bring her chicks back together, even if it was at the very brink. The rest, she knew, was up to forces far beyond her control. Aunt Lara's usually calm demeanor had shattered. Her face, usually a roadmap of gentle wisdom, was now contorted with raw terror as she tried to calm John, who thrashed weakly in his bed, his eyes wide with an animal fear. The stridor was no longer just a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled through his chest, a death rattle in slow motion. Each breath was a heroic, agonizing battle, his chest heaving, his airways collapsing with every desperate intake. "John! John, listen to me!" Lara's voice, usually a soothing balm, was shrill with panic. She pressed the emergency call button repeatedly, her hands trembling so violently she nearly missed it. "The nurses are coming, dear. They're coming." But John wasn't listening. He was locked in a solitary combat with the unseen enemy in his throat, a struggle for the most basic act of survival. The world narrowed to the desperate gasp for air, the searing pain, the terrifying certainty that this was the end. His vision blurred, edges darkening, and a cold numbness began to creep up his limbs. He heard Lara's frantic pleas, the distant thud of running footsteps, the urgent voices of medical staff. But it all seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by the roaring in his ears. And then, through the haze, he heard Lara's desperate whisper, pressed close to his ear, her voice cracking with unshed tears. "Tell B, I'm sorry, about the boundary." The words torn from his very soul had been a ragged, painful expulsion, a final, desperate act of contrition before the darkness claimed him. He saw Lara nod, tears streaming down her face, a silent promise. And then, the world went black. He drifted in a hazy, timeless space, a land between wakefulness and oblivion. There was no pain, no fear, just a quiet drift. He was aware of hushed voices, the rhythmic beep of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic, and something else. Something warm and familiar, like freshly turned earth. When he finally surfaced, it was slow, a reluctant ascension from the depths. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy. He forced them open, blinking against the sterile hospital light. The first thing he registered was the insistent, rhythmic hiss of a ventilator, but it wasn't connected to him. It was to his side. The second thing he saw was Aunt Lara, her head bowed, asleep in the armchair next to his bed, her hands still clasped around his. The third, a figure slumped in the chair opposite. Facing away from him, her shoulders slumped, a familiar shock of auburn hair. Beatrice. His throat pulsed with a dull ache, but the suffocating grip was gone. He swallowed, a tiny tentative movement, and felt no immediate obstruction. The stridor, the terrifying high-pitched scream that had haunted his last waking moments, was absent. His breathing, though shallow and weak, was his own. He tried to speak, to call out to Alara, but only a dry, reedy croak escaped. It was enough. Alara's head snapped up. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, widened in disbelief. "John?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze swept over him, searching, disbelieving. She squeezed his hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't mind. "Oh, John, thank God. You're awake." The movement, the sound, stirred Beatrice. She slowly sat up, turning her head. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide, glistening with tears he hadn't seen since their childhood. There was no anger, no resentment, only a raw, unvarnished vulnerability that mirrored his own. "John," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. He tried again, forcing air over still tender vocal cords. "B." It was ragged, barely a whisper, but it was his voice, a sound. Beatrice rose slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal. She reached out, hesitantly, and gently touched his arm. "Anna Lara told me about what you said." Her voice wavered. "And the boundary? And Grandpa?" John closed his eyes, a wave of profound relief washing over him. He had said it. He had apologized. He had released the burden. I should have listened," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength, though still laced with pain. "I should have known it wasn't just you. It was all of us. The silence." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, John, for leaving. For the years of silence." He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her perhaps for the first time in decades. The little girl who had followed him around the farm, the teenager who had rebelled, the woman who had become a stranger, all of her was there, in her eyes, in her trembling hands. And in that moment, the dam of years of unspoken hurt, of buried resentment, finally broke. He couldn't speak much, but he could nod. He could hold her gaze, and he could feel it, a warmth spreading through his chest, not the searing pain of his illness, but something soft, healing, like sunlight after a long, dark storm. The doctors were baffled, beyond baffled. They used words like unprecedented, remarkable, medically inexplicable. John had been on the precipice of intubation, his airway closing, his prognosis grim. Yet somehow he had stabilized. Not just stabilized, but begun to improve. Follow-up scans, ordered with a mixture of hope and skepticism, showed something even more astounding. The tumor, which had been growing aggressively, showing no response to the last round of treatment, had begun to shrink. Not dramatically, not yet, but undeniably. Its edges were softer, its density less pronounced. The stridor, which had been a constant threat, had vanished entirely. His breathing, though still shallow, was unlabored. Beatrice remained. She didn't talk about his illness, not directly. Instead, she sat by his bedside, reading aloud from old dog-eared letters found in Aunt Alara's trunk. Letters from their great-grandmother, detailing the early days of the Whispering Acre, the struggles and triumphs of generations of farmers. She spoke of childhood memories, not of the fights or the distance, but of the sun-drenched afternoons in the fields, of catching fireflies in mason jars, of the secret fort they'd built near the old oak tree. She brought him his favorite heirloom tomato, ripened from Alara's garden, and though he could only manage a tiny mashed spoonful, the taste of home was a powerful tonic, and slowly, painstakingly, John's voice returned. It was still hoarse, a gravelly whisper, but it was clear enough for him to communicate, clear enough for him to talk to Beatrice, not just about the past, but about the present, about the fear, the despair, and the fragile, burgeoning hope. Their shared vulnerability, The raw honesty of their conversations seemed to unlock something profound within him. It was as if the emotional burden he had carried, the silent, festering wound of their fractured family, had been a weight on his physical being, exacerbating his illness. And now, with that weight lifted, with the thread of their connection rewoven, his body miraculously was responding. The doctors might call it inexplicable, a spontaneous regression, but John, in the quiet depths of his soul, knew it was something else entirely. It was the breath of forgiveness, exhaling the past, inhaling a future he hadn't dared to dream possible. The world narrowed to the desperate gasp for air, the searing pain, the terrifying certainty that this was the end. His vision blurred, edges fading into a gray tunnel. He was an animal caught in a snare, thrashing, dying. The Strider was a deafening shriek in his own ears, a sound that ripped through his chest. He felt consciousness fraying, a fragile thread about to snap. Then a new sound cut through the suffocating noise of his own struggle. A voice, clear and strong, yet tinged with a raw, undeniable ache he hadn't heard in years. "John! Can you hear me, John?" It was Beatrice. He couldn't open his eyes fully, but he felt a cool hand, surprisingly gentle, on his fevered brow. It wasn't Alara's. It was smaller, firmer. Beatrice. She was here. The thought, fragmented and fleeting, pierced through the fog of pain and panic. "I'm here, John." Her voice wavered, closer now, a faint echo of the girl who used to drag him through the tall cornstalks. "Aunt Alara told me. I'm here." He wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but his throat was a vice, his lungs starved for air. The Strider reached a crescendo, a high-pitched whistle that vibrated through his entire body. He felt a sudden, terrifying pressure, a final tightening. His breath hitched, failed to come. Blackness began to consume the edges of his vision. "No!" Beatrice's voice was a desperate cry. He felt her hand grip his fiercely. "No, John, don't you dare! You fought so hard. You apologized, John. You apologized. Don't give up now." Through the encroaching darkness, a faint image flickered. Beatrice, a child, her face smeared with dirt, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, as he, a boy barely older, pulled her from the tangled barbed wire fence that marked the family boundary. He'd helped her then, patched her up, despite his grandfather's stern warnings about that side of the family. He'd forgotten that moment, buried under layers of ingrained resentment in family lore. But she hadn't. A new sensation, faint but distinct, surfaced from the suffocating depths of his struggle. It was a warmth, starting from where her hand clutched his, spreading slowly. Not physical heat, but something deeper, a vital current. It was the warmth of connection, of a shared history, of a bond that had been twisted and buried, but not severed. He felt a subtle shift, a tiny, almost imperceptible softening in his throat. It was like a long-held knot beginning to loosen, infinitesimal movement, but it was movement. He fought for air, not with the same desperate clawing panic, but with a renewed, almost desperate hope. The Strider, though still present, seemed to thin, to lose some of its piercing edge. He heard the nurses burst in, their voices urgent, the squeak of gurney wheels, a flurry of controlled chaos. He felt hands on him, prodding, assessing, a cool antiseptic smell. But through it all, Beatrice's hand remained clasped in his, a lifeline. "His SATs are... they're improving," a voice stunned said. "The Strider, it's lessening." He didn't understand the medical jargon, but he understood the shift. The blackness receded. The terrifying pressure in his throat eased, just enough to allow a shallow, ragged breath. Then another, and another. Each one a small, hard-won victory. Beatrice's voice, now thick with tears, was a balm. "John, can you hear me now?" He opened his eyes, truly opened them this time. Her face, tear-streaked and pale, was directly above his, etched with an exhaustion that mirrored his own, but also with an incandescent relief. He couldn't speak, not yet, but he squeezed her hand. A single, profound squeeze. He heard her breath catch, and then she leaned down, resting her forehead against his, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. The next few days were a blur of medical astonishment. Dr. Aries, usually so stoic, kept shaking his head, muttering about anomalous response and unprecedented regression. The tumor, which had seemed to be aggressively closing his airway, was, according to follow-up scans, showing clear signs of shrinking. Not just stopping, but regressing. The stridor, that terrifying herald of imminent collapse, faded to an occasional rasp, then disappeared entirely. His voice, though still hoarse, began its slow, miraculous return. It was a whisper at first, then a rough murmur, then finally a low, gravelly sound that was undeniably his own. "Beatrice," he croaked one afternoon, startling her from a doze in the chair beside his bed. Her eyes flew open, wide. "John, what is it?" "You came," he managed, the words a monumental effort, but clear. A tear tracked down her cheek. "Of course I came. You're my brother." She squeezed his hand, and this time, the warmth that coursed through him wasn't just comfort, it was a profound sense of peace. The heavy weight that had pressed down on him for years, the unspoken resentments, the buried hurts, seemed to lift, leaving a lightness in its wake. The doctors had no explanation. They spoke of spontaneous regression, of the mysterious power of the human body, of the unpredictable nature of cancer. But John knew, and Beatrice knew. The healing wasn't just physical. It was the breath of forgiveness, the mending of a decades-old wound that had finally allowed him to truly breathe again. The shadow in his throat hadn't just been a tumor. It had been the physical manifestation of a deeper, spiritual constriction. And in loosening that knot, the impossible had become possible.